Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Microbiology Basics. This is the second of two webinars that will introduce the producer to general principles of food microbiology and modern mechanisms for the discovery and prevention of microbial growth in foods. We will discuss the type and number of microorganisms in foods, bacteria, fungi, viruses and other agents, parasites, algae, and others. We will discuss issues with foodborne illness in certain types of foods, focusing on raw and ready-to-eat vegetables, fruits, and nuts. We will also identify the basic foodborne illnesses resulting from microorganisms and human health impacts of such diseases. This webinar is part of a series of food safety webinars coordinated and conducted by the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative to help Native American farmers, ranchers, and food producers to begin to understand the importance of food safety and what is necessary to reach compliance under the Food Safety Modernization Act. Attendees will learn about produce safety, foodborne pathogens, worker health, wildlife, land use, post-harvest handling, and legal issues associated with food safety in Indian country. This series is part of a twofold effort to reach producers and food businesses. The IFAI will soon launch a series of two-day in-person events in regional locations. Stay tuned to our website at indigenousfoodandag.com for the announcement of these hands-on trainings. The in-person grower training events will result in the award of a certificate. The webinars we are hosting will help prepare you for understanding these issues and will help prepare you to participate more deeply in the grower training events. We will not award a certificate for the webinar trainings. We merely are trying to broaden knowledge of the important principles that will be covered in the two-day grower training events. If you look at the handout section of your control panel, you'll see a flyer that contains all the information you'll need to join other webinars in this series. You'll also find the slideshow being presented today. I invite you to visit our website at indigenousfoodandag.com, where you'll find more information about our food safety trainings, downloadable copies of the presentations, and archived videos of the completed webinars. The materials we are using are part of Produce Safety Alliance approved training. The issues will cover business practices, microbiology, and legal issues, and are additional information our experts think is important to have access to as a grower. All attendees will be muted during the presentation. Today's presenter, Dr. John Marcy, will take questions at the end of the presentation. Attendees can either use the control panel to raise their hand or submit a question by using the questions feature of the control panel. Today's presentation is possible through a 3-year cooperative agreement between the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and the IFAI to provide Native American outreach, training, technical assistance, and education to ensure compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act. Our work is part of the broad efforts we will undertake to provide outreach, training, technical assistance, and education on food safety issues. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. John Marcy. Dr. Marcy is a professor and food scientist at the University of Arkansas Cooperative Extension Service who focuses on hazard analysis, critical control point, or HACCP compliance, and quality, sanitation, and microbiology for food, plants, and meat, primarily poultry. He served for 2 years on the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Food Safety Criteria and 4 years on the National Advisory Committee for Meat and Poultry Inspection. He is a certified food scientist from the Institute of Food Technologists and received his PhD from Iowa State University in food technology in 1987. With that, I will hand the presentation over to Dr. Marcy.
Thank you, Brian. And I appreciate being here with you today, or whenever you get to view this. This is an important part of an educational process leading up to when you actually take food safety preventive controls for human foods for the Food Safety Modernization Act process, or whether you're taking hazard analysis critical control points for any meat and poultry processing that you may be doing. Next slide, please. When we talk about food safety, it's important to know that, it's a common occurrence that people get sick. When I say common, you probably read about it often, but it's a function of, just how much food that we eat and the probability that someone will mishandle it. I have this Los Angeles Times headline with, for whatever reason, a photo of male mature turkeys, which has nothing to do with food safety. But, it's a headline in August of 2011 that, someone in California died due to ground turkey or tainted turkey. And actually for months, we knew that there was a problem somewhere, but we didn't know until the next day that the problem was actually here in Springdale, Arkansas, which is 10 miles from the university campus. Next slide, please. In that outbreak, there was 136 people infected with a strain of Salmonella Heidelberg, and Heidelberg is one of the more aggressive strains. There's a couple thousand strains of Salmonella. Some are more dangerous than others. But in this country, we tend to treat them all the same. And that may continue on, but if you look at this, people were sick between February 27th and on to September 13th. So it was, over 6 months of dealing with knowing that there was a problem somewhere. Is very sporadic, and that's what's hard to track down. It wasn't a constant occurrence. It happened a week here, a day here, all over the country. And this one plant in Arkansas was shipping all over the country. So 136 people infected. 91 of them had information gathered by the CDC, and 37 of them were actually hospitalized, and one person died. And over 36 million pounds of product recalled. Now, I never did find out how much actually was brought back, because that was over a 2-year period that they recalled. So, but that's a lot of product. What I need you to understand is that, we have a changing world out there in the way foodborne illness is being looked at. Next slide, please. Here's another one, several years later, Heidelberg again, but the consequences were different. 134 persons infected, 7 strains. So having 7 strains tells you that it may not have been coming from one plant. There's some, this is related to Foster Farms, but some of these states didn't receive chicken from the plant that this was originally associated with. So it's unclear whether that was a culprit or not. But the way foodborne illnesses are tracked is through something called PulseNet. So if someone gets sick, they take the bacteria that they isolate and they do a genetic fingerprint. And then they share that genetic fingerprint across all the health departments. And at the same time, they take samples from meat and poultry plants. And if they get a match, then they suspect that may be where it came from. But it's not an infallible system. So not all the strains of Salmonella Heidelberg, it can be all across the industry. Salmonella is not uncommon to a poultry plant. So what happened in this case, and this happened primarily in the summer, and Salmonella always goes up in the summer. However, there was one factor associated with this outbreak that a lot of the people were buying rotisserie chickens from a single Costco location in California. And their mishandling of the product may have led to it being much more noticeable than just seasonal adjusted salmonellosis. So the health departments were looking at it, and they only recalled 1 week of product, as opposed to the 36 million pounds in 2011 from Cargill. So the reason that the USDA didn't recall it has to do with the California Department of Health, which is on the next slide. The USDA does not have the authority to force a recall, but they can request it. And almost never does someone decide not to recall the product. FDA, on the other hand, actually has the capability to order a recall. That came along with FSMA. I don't think it's a huge issue either way. Most companies do recall, especially if they think there's a problem. With California, one reason there was not a requested recall was the director of the Department of Health issued this statement that with proper handling and preparation, it was safe for consumption. And that's always true. However, that day may be even passed even for health departments. So it's unclear what will happen going forward. I think we're seeing, at least in the legal sense, much more focus on getting things right. Meat and poultry are always going to be associated with some level of bacteria, some pathogens in the raw state. That's not true for the Food and Drug Administration purview. Most of the things in their purview do not normally harbor pathogens. So when they come in and fire pathogens in the environment, they're probably going to request a recall. There's several recalls going on now for Listeria that was found in an environment, not in the product, which seems to be the case anymore. Now, in terms of salmonella on poultry, the courts ruled a long time ago that if it's naturally occurring, if a defect is naturally occurring, and it's normally made safe through handling, the normal preparation, then that's not an adulterated product. Now, USDA will say that if someone gets sick, they consider it adulterated. And adulterated is a legal term, meaning it can't be sold. It's unsafe at that point. The science says that salmonella on raw chicken is a hazard, but it's not an adulterant. When we test chicken in the plant, we're looking to make a judgment about the process, not the product. We don't test chicken to find out whether we're going to ship it or not if it has salmonella. Next slide. So when we talk about a hazard, we're looking at a biological, chemical, and FDA, rightly so, included radiological under chemical, or physical agent that has potential to cause illness or injury. So if you look at that definition, and 21 CFR is the FDA version, but under HACCP, that's the same wording except for the radiological. And radiological actually does make sense. When FSMA first came out, before the Food Safety Modernization Act first came out, and before the regs were fully in place, FDA was talking about making radiological a separate hazard category, which I'm glad they did not, because it's really not separate. It is a chemical. It's a radioactive isotope. And primarily this was on top of mind after the earthquake in Japan that damaged the nuclear reactor, nuclear power plant in Japan. And so there was likelihood that certain seaweed products or other ingredients coming out of the ocean could have radiological contamination. And without specifying that you would include this in your hazard analysis, you don't have documentation that people ask the question, is this something to worry about? So that's why it's in there, and it is a chemical hazard. But people hadn't been addressing it prior to that we know of. Next slide. What it does not necessarily refer to is violations of standards, particularly regulatory, not directly related to food safety. When we talk about quality issues, those are typically negotiable. Food safety is not. If you have a problem, you've got a problem. You can't say, well, we'll do better next time. So the things that they're talking about is economic fraud. It's illegal to substitute a lesser value ingredient. You can't put in, soy flour for meat, or a cheaper ingredient when you're advertising that on the label that it contains something of more value, what people are buying. But certain economic frauds, there's an asterisk. It may actually have a specific safety issue. There was a case from a foreign supplier that was actually grinding peanut shells and putting it in cumin. That's economic fraud that actually had an allergenic risk. So it became a food safety issue as well. Things such as spoilage. Yeah, it's spoiled, but that doesn't mean it's unsafe. Those are two different things. Now, it could still be unsafe. But that's a separate category. Insect fragments, hair, filth. You're not allowed to process food in a filthy environment. You're not supposed to have hair in the product, but you're not likely to make someone sick that way. If you can't control the situation, if you can't control the filth, if you don't pay attention to what you're doing producing food, then you can and will be shut down and maybe prosecuted. But that means you've lost control of your system. These things typically don't happen very often if you're paying attention to what you do. So while they don't fall under your hazard analysis, you still have to meet regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. When we look at how we know what is happening out there, manufacturers are required after the Food Safety Modernization Act that if they know that there's a problem in their food, they've got 24 hours to report that there may be unsafe food in commerce. That's the reportable food registry. So these are things that, people turn themselves in so that we know they're happening. So we have a positive Listeria monocytogenes. As you can see, undeclared allergens is about a third of them. And if you look at foodsafety.gov and look at all the recalls, most of the recalls that happen are because of undeclared allergens. And usually that's just a mislabeling. And it may just be a paperwork. It may not have even, it's maybe in distribution, but we see a lot of stock withdrawals or recalls due to a mislabel. Now, under the law, a mislabeled product is adulterated. So it's not allowed to be in commerce. Salmonella is probably the most common pathogen reported out there. In ready-to-eat foods, we have a zero tolerance for it, and we have a zero tolerance for Listeria monocytogenes. Both of those are pretty serious organisms that I'll talk more about later, but they're not allowed at any level in foods that's not going to be cooked. Most of the world actually does allow in ready-to-eat foods a level of 100 organisms per gram of Listeria monocytogenes, but you have to appreciate that what this organism is capable of. It can cause sudden abortions. It can kill fetuses. So it's not politically acceptable in this country to allow any level. And this is where you'll see FDA, when they come in, they will be swabbing the environment all over a facility. And they're looking for L monocytogenes. Next slide. So this is a slide showing the reported outbreaks. This is not an estimate. These are ones over a 5-year period that are actual numbers. You know, this is not, well, we think these many are happening. You know, we estimate in 2011 that there was 47 million illnesses. Well, you know, these are, you know, actual, you can count the people. These aren't estimates. So if you look at outbreaks, and an outbreak is defined as 2 or more people with a common source. So there's, you know, 2,500 outbreaks across the country in a 5-year period. 52,750 illnesses. 13,770 unknown. You know, and actually, if you look at the estimates, the unknown are actually a whole lot higher than the known when they estimate. They put a lot of windage into that one. The deaths, we really do usually have a pretty good handle on. Next slide. So when we talk about biological hazards, primarily it's going to be bacteria, and we'll spend most of the time on that. Viruses do make people sick. However, we don't see a lot of viruses that are capable of surviving through the manufacturing and distribution. Viruses are primarily a function of immediate contact with a food service worker. You know, they don't live that long out in the environment. So our distribution system pretty much precludes much problem with viruses. If there were a problem, you'd probably see it in produce before you'd see it anywhere else, because there's no heat step. Protozoa, you know, we'll talk about parasites in a little more detail. You know, they're an issue, but you know, the viruses, the protozoa, you know, don't grow on food. You know, food is not living. These are parasites. Food is just a vector form, so the control is outside the food system. Yeast and molds primarily are spoilage organisms. Mold, by definition, does cause some toxins, mycotoxins. Most of them are not acutely toxic. You're not going to get sick within hours or days. But the aflatoxins are significant carcinogens. So they may cause or contribute to cause of cancer, you know, 20, 30 years from now. So they're not, you know, they need to be controlled in food. Exposure needs to be understood and minimized. Prions are not something that we deal much with. In the meat industry, this is what causes mad cow. Chronic wasting, you know, not usually foodborne. We limit the prion, we limit the exposure by taking out nervous system material from older cattle, or only use young beef cattle for most of the food that you're talking about. So it's not something that we deal with much in the distribution system. When we talk about pathogens, most of the bacteria are not pathogens. We don't live in a sterile world, and your gut is anywhere but sterile. Next slide, please. When we look at the #1 cause of foodborne illness, according to CDC, is norovirus. Now, you know, I question how much of that is foodborne. It's easily transmitted person to person. It's the winter flu. When you're in a confined space, someone throws up, your kids will bring it home to you, and they throw up, and you're standing there, you had to clean it, and you get sick the next day, and you're sick for a day. 24-hour flu, which there's no such thing. It's norovirus. very common. There's many ways to get it. Go on a cruise ship for more than a week with 5,000 people, and someone's probably going to get sick. It's very contagious. Hepatitis A really is typically foodborne or waterborne. The problem with that, and it's transmitted like a lot of other foodborne illnesses, it's called fecal oral transmission. Doesn't sound good. Hope you're not eating lunch while I'm talking. But what happens is that it takes about 90 days for, anywhere from 45 to 90 days for the hepatitis A to actually show up and cause symptoms. And the week before you actually get sick is when you're shedding the most virus particles in your stool. And so if you have a young food service worker that doesn't pay attention to hand washing, then they make your taco and they handle the lettuce. Well, you know, in about a week or two when they get sick, you're going to find out that if anyone who ate there in the last 3 weeks needs to report to the health department. And then you see 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000 people have to go to the health department to get a shot. So it's very newsworthy. You know, it's going to make the headlines when hepatitis A breaks out. It's not very common anymore because there's a Hep A vaccine. And actually, speaking from experience around Arkansas, Oklahoma was almost epidemic, and also West Memphis, Arkansas, had a real problem with it. And what they started doing was vaccinating all the school children and preschool. If you break it early, it's because those little kids would actually carry the virus but not actually show symptoms, and they transfer it to their older siblings working in a food service environment, and it just spread. So the vaccine has really gone a long way to curb that food service passage. But the real control of that is hand washing. You gotta understand that you gotta wash your hands after going to the bathroom. Next slide, please. I guess I've already spent some time talking about that, but exclusion of ill food handlers. If you have diarrhea, you don't need to be working. In fact, you really need to tell your employer. When I talk about fecal oral transmission, diarrhea is what we're referring to. The problem with like hepatitis A is you're really shedding viruses before you're sick. So you can't wait till you're sick to start washing hands. You got to do it before then. Now, this proper disposal of human feces and elimination of insufficiently treated sewage. This slide actually comes from the FDA, from the Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance, and this is an international program. So it's not so much that we have a problem here in this country, but I'm sure there's places where this may be a problem with human feces. Or actually, I shared a lab with a guy from El Salvador when I was in grad school, and he said they would always have shigellosis, which really comes from humans. It's somewhat similar to the hepatitis, but the flies would carry it. In the start of the rainy season, they would have a fly bloom, and the flies were leaving the insufficiently treated sewage was everywhere, not just on crops. And so they would get shigellosis. As we look to organic, and then there's been some issues of people using improperly composted, maybe not human sewage, but certainly animal manure to fertilize. So it's important to understand the concepts that go on with composting and the heat that it generates in order to make it safe to use for human food. Cooking does kill these viruses, so they're really a problem with ready-to-eat foods or just hand contact. person to person, like norovirus, just touching the handrails on the steps and things like that. Hand to mouth contact is a problem. Next slide. Same way with the foodborne parasites, that they do not grow in food. Viruses do not grow in food. Food is just the vector. I don't know if you're familiar with any of these. Giardia is one that normally is associated with hiking in the woods and drinking out of a stream. Toxoplasma is normally associated with cats, but cats are a vector for it. The toxoplasma the cats have can actually reside in the environment, and it can cause birth defects. Other animals may well have toxoplasma. They don't spread it around, but they harbor it. And so there may be some level in the food supply. So it's killed by cooking, it's destroyed, made inactive. Just all the parasites are. I actually saw one today, a protozoa. It's a worm. So it's bigger than a protozoa. They're having a problem in Hawaii right now, associated with snails and a real small organism they have there called a semi-slug that is transmitting a worm, a microscopic worm called a rat lungworm that a couple people have been tourists have started getting that, mainly associated with produce in Hawaii, but also the water. So just because it's not made this big 5 list, there's some new ones out there. I had not heard of that rat lungworm until today. Next slide. So we prevent parasites, with making sure the water is treated. This parasite, like I said, was coming from slugs. It resides in snails and slugs and things like that, but it gets in the water. And evidently in Hawaii, they don't all use water systems. They may catch it in the rainwater or river water runoff, maybe some groundwater. And that's, if they don't keep snails out of their rain barrel, that's where it may happen. And these snails are also getting on produce and lettuce and getting in salads. And that's how people have been impacted in Hawaii. Next slide. Okay. Infections and intoxications. And we're going to bacteria. I'm going to make one more statement about the last part of that slide with said freezing. If you're processing fish, we do this with pork for trichina. It's also done for fish if you want to eat it raw. You can get rid of the worms and the parasites by freezing. That eliminates and that makes them inactive. So if you're handling fish and worried about seafood, that's typically how you'll handle that if you're going to eat it raw. Next slide. Okay, bacterial infections and intoxications. The difference is with an infection, you have to consume the living organism. It's in and on the food, and you've eaten the food, and it goes through your stomach and it gets to your small intestines where it sets up shop. And it grows and multiplies and creates a niche and may produce a toxin in your gut, but it has to grow in your stomach. It's an infection. It's actually growing. And that's usually what we refer to as a pathogen. It's important to understand that because infections usually take 48, 72 hours or more in order to show signs. It's not quick. It's not 2 and 3 hours, which is what happens with an intoxication. So usually we get a pretty good idea of what caused the foodborne illness if we know how long it was after they ate the food. The problem also is that most people don't remember what they had 2 days ago or 3 days. And their first instinct is to say, well, where did I eat out last? You know, they don't think about where they ate at home. We don't, blame mom for what she did to us, and I'm the primary cook, and my wife would blame me, I promise you, and probably rightly so. I may know too much and maybe don't take all the precautions that she would, but I don't worry about it. It's hard to track back sometimes to figure this out, but usually if they can find some food left over, it helps a lot. But a lot of times there is no food left 2 and 3 days later. So an intoxication is either the food is growing, the pathogen grows in the food and produces a toxin. You don't have to eat the living organism. So if you prevent the growth in the food, there is no toxin, there is no illness. You see that big difference. Some of the bacteria do not need to grow in the food to cause an illness. They only have to grow in your gut. You have to be exposed to it. That goes with a concept called infective dose. If you don't have the infective dose, you're not going to get sick. So controlling the growth in the food is always important. But, it may not stop an infection. Some that can cause infection without growth in the food are pathogenic E. coli because they're so infected. It does not take many to cause an illness. Ones that cause intoxications, Staphylococcus aureus, Clostridium botulinum, Bacillus cereus. If they grow and produce the toxin, Staph aureus toxin is heat stable. Even if you cook it, the toxin will be there. That's somewhat true of Bacillus cereus. The Bacillus cereus typically won't grow until you've cooked the food. It's a spore former, just like Clostridium botulinum. So usually they're in cooked foods to start with. In fact, all of them are. With Clostridium botulinum and Bacillus cereus, if you heat the food, you're probably going to get rid of it, the toxin. But it takes a fair amount of heat. Usually with home cooked or home preserved vegetables, they tell you to boil the beans for 20 minutes. That'll get rid of the Clostridium toxin. Next slide, please. This is an old slide, but it highlights the point that, I can promise you that, any food of animal origin will carry pathogens. However, it's important for you to realize that, food is a vehicle to move pathogens from one place to the next. And so there's no food that can't be contaminated. There's no such thing really as a safe food, particularly produce. With due handling, it's probably fine. I mean, we eat so much of it and we very seldom cook any of it. We don't want to cook it. That's why we want it the way it is. We like it raw. But, due care is taken in quantity production to understand what may come in contact with it. So just about any produce that you can think of has had some sort of issue at some point. Now, an animal probably has been involved somewhere. These things just don't happen on their own. There is no spontaneous generation. For instance, Shigella species, it's really only harbored within humans. And so all of these can be water driven. E. coli 0157 typically is not. That's usually an animal, without a doubt. So it's one that understanding. Well, actually, the coleslaw, there was an animal, but it was actually unprocessed sheep manure that caused that outbreak. So there's many reasons to look at. We actually know a whole lot about what causes illness, more than you would care to think about, because there's no limit to what people can do. Next slide, please. Juice. bacteria typically don't grow in juice. This highlights the point that it doesn't have to grow in the food in order to cause a problem. Because of the acidity of juice, almost none of these will grow in it. The acidity doesn't necessarily kill it either. So if the infective dose is there when it's packaged, it's going to be there when it's consumed. That's why, FDA, you look at these all in the 90s, most of this was what led up to the juice HACCP rule. So you either have to pasteurize juice or have a real clear label on it that it's not, and drink at your own risk. Now, we have people here in Arkansas, and I'm sure there's plenty of places that, excuse me, that want to market raw juice, unpasteurized. And that's okay as long as you know exactly what you're putting in there and where you're getting it. But it's not subject to writing a HACCP plan. There's a problem with it because you can't screen it. And the bigger you get, the less trouble you have understanding where your produce is coming from. Next slide, please. And this was a large outbreak that didn't need to happen. Jensen Farms, they had gotten into the business. This was early in the process, and they were, what primarily went wrong was they were audited by a third-party audit, said that they were doing fine, but what they were doing was washing cantaloupe to take to cool it down, because when it comes in from the field, it's pretty warm. And so they were putting it into water, but what they were supposed to be doing was chlorinating that water and to make sure that no bacteria could grow in it. But they didn't chlorinate it, so it was just water. And as cantaloupes broke in this system and let the sugar loose, they actually created their own growth medium for Listeria. And so these cantaloupe had high levels of Listeria. And so when you cut through the rind, you transferred it to the interior of the cantaloupe. Cantaloupe is not acidic like an apple or orange. It's much more neutral with a lot of sugar. And so it's a good medium to grow bacteria. The recommendation for most of these melons is to, use a bleach or something on the rind before you cut it. So you make sure not transfer bacteria to the cut surfaces that will support the growth of bacteria. That combined with how dangerous Listeria monocytogenes is, they had a fair number of people die with it. 147 people infected, 33 associated deaths. That's a high percentage. 1 in 5, 20% roughly is the mortality rate. Next slide, please. I put this one here to emphasize that there's always victims to foodborne illness. When Brian said I was on the National Advisory Committee for Meat and Poultry Inspection for 4 years, I served on that committee with Alex Donnelly's mother and Kevin Kowalczyk's grandmother. Both of those little boys passed away from E. coli 015787. Stephanie Smith was a dance instructor before she got E. coli 015787 poisoning from ground beef, and she lost the use of her legs. She cannot walk or dance anymore. So there's a human toll. There are faces behind this. Like I said, it doesn't happen often, but to the people it happens to, it can be very serious. Next slide, please. And it's not just human health toll. I mean, it affects people. This is the bluebell listeria. There was only 10 cases, but the 3 of those people died. But the plant shut down. They cut 1,400 jobs and furloughed another 1,400 people. There's a lot of economic loss with it too. It's not good business. There is no business plan that has you making your customers sick. Companies do survive it, but it takes a heavy toll on everybody. There is nothing good that happens from it. So a lot of times we talk about food safety culture, is making sure that by and large, you want to make sure you're doing everything you can. And that's why we get into the management programs of food safety preventive controls, or HACCP, to document that we do everything we can in manufacturing. Next slide, please. So what is food safety? An unsafe food is food that's been contaminated with a harmful substance, is injurious to health when consumed. So that when consumed is important because, like I said before, we talk about salmonella or other pathogens, and salmonella is not the only pathogen. Campylobacter, you name it, almost any pathogen can be on raw foods of animal origin. So anytime you have raw food from an animal, you have some level of risk. However, it's usually considered a defect, not an adulterant, because it's naturally occurring. We're not at the point where we can say we can do this without any risk. We're just not there yet. So it's unsafe, but typically it's made safe prior to consumption. That means it's okay. It's not subject to recall. It's not adulterated. So what we're trying to do is reduce the risk. Food safety preventive controls and HACCP are not zero risk. They're risk management, risk reduction, doing everything you can to manage that risk, manage that exposure, so that you know that when you're producing the product, if you have a problem, you catch it before it leaves the building. That's the best you can hope for, by and large. Next slide, please. Quality, on the other hand, that's different. Does it meet the customer's expectations? Customers don't buy based on safety. They buy based on the quality. Now, if you're good at what you do and you're consistent and you have a good product, people will keep buying it. Now, even if you have a food safety problem, you'll have a drop off for sure, but it's a matter of getting it, back to where people expect it to be. Product shelf life is how long the product quality is acceptable, not based in safety. Code dates, Best Buy used, there's controversy right now about people throwing away food that's fine. Food has to have some sort of code on it, and usually there is a date code, arbitrary. Canned goods expire, and it may be 2 years, but canned goods are typically fine for a lot longer. So the date that's on the package may or may not have anything to do with quality or safety. All depends. If it says Best Buy, that means date usually means the quality has deteriorated. So it can be oxidation, which will happen at some rate, or it can be bacterial spoilage. However, that's not safety, and so it's not usually part of your food safety plan. You need to separate those discussions out. Those are quality driven and they're negotiable. Next slide. So when we look at what we use in manufacturing, and I'll use this from the framework of what I've done for most of my career, is based in meat and poultry. So we'll throw another one here at the end. So good manufacturing practices, GMPs. That used to be Part 110 of the Code of Federal Regulations from FDA. But with the Food Safety Modernization Act, that's now Part 117, Subpart B is where you'll find good manufacturing practices. USDA does not generate a separate list. They use what FDA says. Now, the good manufacturing practices are open-ended, if you will. They say that you will consider these situations when you're producing food. You know, facilities, lighting, ventilation, water, you name it. It's a very comprehensive list or series of lists for you to consider that are meant for you to understand what you need to do to produce food. It doesn't tell you how to do it. You're expected to come up with your own, way of managing your facility. But these are the basic things you need to do to be in production. I had an inspector in USDA, said, people ask for the right to produce food. In USDA, they have to apply for a permit. With FDA, you can actually start doing it and then register. But it's not necessarily a God-given right. It's something that you need to play by the rules. You've asked, you want to do this, you need to do it correctly. Standard operating procedures are, a management tool that allows you to put in writing the steps that you're going to do any procedure. It doesn't have to, typically you'll do it for your actual manufacturing. It tells you, what dye to use, who's going to do it, how long it takes, what ingredients go in, step by step. That's a standard operating procedure. And you can write those for any type of job function within the facility. And when we talk about a monitoring step within HACCP, that should be written as a standard operating procedure. This is exactly how you do it. And what standard operating procedures do is make sure that you're consistent. And the more you're consistent, the less variation you have, the more control you have day in, day out. Less chance of something that's aberrant, a variance going undetected. People will notice when something different happens. So the more consistent you are, the more likely you are to know when this is not normal. We've got a problem. Sanitation standard operating procedures are exactly what they sound like. They're written procedures on how to clean a facility. They may or may not be as detailed as you would think they should be. In the meat and poultry world, they're usually not that precise just because of the way it's regulated. That if you say you have to have a certain temperature of water and you drop below that, the regulators may give you a problem. However, they're in general terms. And last but not least is the hazard analysis critical control point system, which focuses only on the food safety, not about the quality. And in the FSMA world, we're talking about the food safety plan. That, it's the same thing. One part of the food safety plan incorporates process controls, which are the same thing as critical control points. You're going to do a hazard analysis. You're going to determine your critical control points, but you're going to call them process preventive controls to go along with your allergen preventive controls and your other preventive controls. So all of these are programs that help manufacturers document and do what they need to do in order to have safe food. Next slide, please. So this is, these are estimates. This is where this is not the 47 million. These are the ones that they know of. This is from the same table in 2011, but this is only the ones that they actually know about. So their estimate was 47 million. What they knew about was just 9 point something. Deaths they know about from the known categories. 1,200, 1,300 deaths per year. These are estimates, but they're from the known categories of causes. So it's not inconsequential. Next slide. So when we look at the total estimate from the 31 known, that's where they get that 9.4 million and the 1,300 deaths. But then you look at what they unspecified, so 80% of the foodborne illness estimate, that up to that 47.8 million, they can't specify what caused it. They don't know. We don't know how many, we know it's better than what they did before because it came down from 76 million to 48 million. But there's still a lot of windage in the estimate. Next slide. Now, just looking at the 9-point-something million, they attribute 58% of that to norovirus. So that's ones that they actually know about. They're still estimating. There's 5 million cases. That may or well be. However, whether all norovirus is not foodborne. But they're lumping it in there in their estimate. Non-typhoidal salmonella is pretty significant. 1 million cases a year, and that actually may be totally correct. That's still an estimate. So these are only looking at the ones that they know. The other ones they don't. They have the larger estimates for. So these are the top 5, and they account for 91% of the estimate. Next slide. Now these are ones that require hospitalization, and so these actual numbers are probably a lot more credible. Because a lot of people don't go to the doctor. Even if they go to the doctor, they don't need hospitalization. Once they get into hospitals, they get a pretty good idea. And actually that is because of something called FoodNet that started after the 1993 Jack in the Box. President Bill Clinton started FoodNet. And FoodNet is an active surveillance tool used by CDC. I think it's in 7 locations in the US, where CDC actually goes to the hospitals on a daily basis and surveys anyone that's in there for diarrhea or anything that may look like foodborne illness. They go talk to them. So it's active. If you go to the doctor, they may or may not do a test, and the doctor may or may not ever tell the health department, and the health department may or may not tell the state, and then the state may or may not send information to CDC in Atlanta. Now, the pipeline is meant to go to Atlanta, but it doesn't always work. Not everything goes through. FoodNet, on the other hand, is people who actually go to hospitals and look for people. So it's active surveillance. So this, once they get to the hospital, is a pretty good number. So we look at salmonella, we're now up to 20,000 hospitalizations and an estimate for a year. And that's probably pretty good. I'm actually surprised by the 14,000 norovirus. That seems high to me. Some of these others, Shiga produced in E. coli, STEC, that's what that stands for, Shiga E. coli. We've actually cut down the incidence level of STEC. It doesn't happen much anymore. Usually when it does happen, it's actually in produce. There's very little of it occurring with meat anymore. Next slide, please. And then we get to the deaths, and it's kind of confusing. Salmonella, 378 deaths, 28% of what they know. And the next one is Toxoplasma gondii, which is a parasite. And that one threw me until I had to do some more reading. And it's not associated with cats. It's once you have this organism, there's no cure. It's a parasite that forms a cyst, and you've got it. And then as you, for whatever reason, if transplant, if your immune system, as it goes downhill, this organism can take over, and that may be the cause of death. But so it's not. It's a serious organism, but it may or may not be foodborne. People get exposed to it in multiple ways, but there is no cure for it. Once you have it, you have it. And the rest of them are fairly straightforward. What you need to look, listeria doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it's more deadly than most. 20% mortality. Next slide, please. So those are generalities. Let me talk specifically about the bacteria. We're doing fine on time. The spore-forming bacteria, these are important because these actually like to be cooked. So when you say, well, just cook it. Well, when you cook it, you actually get rid of all the others, but these are left, and they actually don't become a problem before you cook it. They're harmless. They're spores. They're like seeds. Next slide. Clostridium botulinum. It's ubiquitous in nature, present in the soil. You eat it every time you eat salad. You eat it every day. Doesn't hurt you. The spore does not germinate in your stomach. There's roughly about 145 cases per year. 15% are foodborne. And that typically is in Alaska. People trying to ferment in the ground, and they don't get a good lactic acid fermentation growing, and it's anaerobic, and it grows. 65% infant of that 145. That's usually by giving an infant honey. Clostridium botulinum does not grow, does not germinate at a pH at 4.6 and below. And an infant stomach has a pH above that. You're an adult, has a pH well below that. So you can eat spores all day long, no problem. And the wound botulism is if you get a dirt into a wound and seal it up to where it has no oxygen. That's wound botulism. It produces a toxin, a nerve agent. The other one that can cause that, it's not wound botulism, it's gas gangrene. It's caused by Clostridium perfringens, same situation. It's also a foodborne illness. Next slide. So this was, there was a couple cases in 2011. This is one. There was one in Ohio and one in Georgia. This is just the one in Ohio, where the issue with Clostridium, it's a toxin, it's a nerve agent, the most toxic substance we know of ever. 5 ounces can kill everybody in the world. It's very potent, but you don't feel bad. You have trouble breathing, blurred vision, you want to lay down, but you're not nauseous, you're not vomiting, you don't have diarrhea. But it progresses. Next segment. Usually you have trouble breathing. Every hospital has bought antitoxin. So usually very seldom do people die from it. You notice the bad taste, it was bulging. He threw it away. Next. He had bought it from a refrigerator section, but he had kept it unrefrigerated for 42 days. It was cold potato soup. He was 57 and then rehab. But most people never recover fully. I mean, they recover, but the nerve damage is done for life. Next slide. One of the other spore formers, Clostridium perfringens. This is probably one of the more common foodborne illness. Usually you see it when big banquets are done, and they start making stuff a couple days ahead. It's actually a fairly common organism. It's a spore former. It's anaerobic, but it's not strictly anaerobic. It'll tolerate some oxygen. It survives cooking. It's actually a toxin-mediated infection, which only means that you actually have to eat the living organism and it produces a toxin in your gut. It's abdominal pain, because it's, when I talked earlier about gas gangrene, the abdominal pain is caused by this thing. Causes explosive diarrhea. It produces a lot of CO2. So you feel pretty bad. The incubation, this is what tells you it's 6 hours to 24. That's what tells you it's a toxin. It's got to grow in your gut, but it's usually, it's not just a little bit. Usually when you get it, you've got quite an exposure to it. Next slide. So the non-spore forming bacteria, the key part, and there was a third that I don't have a slide for, it's Bacillus cereus, which is aerobic, but it doesn't occur a whole lot. Where we see the non-spore forming, what's important, all of these are killed by cooking, every one of them. Nothing fancy, nothing, normal cooking will kill all of these organisms. So it's important that you don't contaminate it afterward. So the ones before that, the 2 Clostridiums and the Bacillus, they're not killed by cooking. In fact, they like to be cooked. They're a problem after you cook. So you have to chill it appropriately. Chilling requirements, cooling requirements in the food code are based upon Clostridium perfringens. Also in the USDA code as well. It's called stabilization. So all of these are killed by cooking. Next slide, please. So Salmonella, probably the most common. It's the one that causes the most deaths, the one that causes the most hospitalizations. So there's a couple thousand types of it. Some are more dangerous than others. There's probably not an animal you can't find it with. It's out in nature. Infective dose, 10 to the 7th, which is 10 million, to 10 to the 9th, which is 1 and 9 zeros, or a billion per gram. Now that's high. Now, Salmonella Heidelberg, Enteritidis, Typhimurium, there's been reports that it may only take 500 cells. It's much more dangerous. Typically, when I talk about 500 cells, that might be what's on a whole chicken. So typically the infective dose on a chicken is not enough to cause illness. It actually has to get somewhere else and grow in order to cause illness. But the issue with Salmonella, and we've gotten parts down to about 2% positive, but you can't look at a piece of chicken and tell whether it has it or not. So any food of animal origin, you have to treat like it's got pathogenic bacteria on it, because you'll never be able to tell. If you eat raw meat, you do so with some level of risk. I hope you understand that. Next slide. I want to bring this in because it's a pretty unique situation. We've had several significant outbreaks with Salmonella enteritidis, and enteritidis is one of the primary ones that is capable of going from the intestinal tract of the chicken through into the systematic to the ovaries. It can go other places, but the ovary is the one part that we're concerned about with the egg. So if you see that where it says the vitellin membrane on the right-hand side, which points to what we would call the yolk membrane. There's actually 2 membranes there. There's one on the yolk and one on the white, so there's a layer. So when you consider that this yolk was in the ovary, the Salmonella gets to the ovary, so it's actually in that yolk membrane, the vitellin membrane. The white is antimicrobial. It's there to protect the embryo from bacteria which can easily go through the pores of the eggshell. The eggshell is porous compared to the size of a bacteria. So this egg white has a couple substances. One's called lysozyme, which will actually cause cells to rupture. And the other is a compound called avidin, a chemical, which binds the iron and makes it unavailable to bacteria to form cell walls. And if you can't form a cell wall, you can't grow. So bacteria that are not associated with the yolk aren't capable of growing. They don't have food. So why I bring that up is that when you consider the temperature of the egg yolk is 105 degrees Fahrenheit, which will easily support the growth of salmonella. And if the salmonella were actually in the yolk, which is highly nutritious, it will support the growth of anything. If it were in there, it takes 28 hours for that egg yolk to go down the oviduct. The egg white is applied, the shell is applied before it's ever laid. You know, if it was actually in the yolk, that yolk would be, you know, up in the billions. It'd be one big mass of salmonella. We don't see that. That's not what happens normally. In the case of the Iowa outbreak, which was the latest one, I think was 2010. Those chickens were quite sick. The guy knew his chickens were sick. He was told they probably had salmonella enteritidis, but he shipped them anyway. He'd gone to Iowa on the context that they didn't make him check his chickens. Yeah, so he's one that should be going to prison. And he may not, I don't know. Next slide. So if we look at salmonella, and what I want to call your attention to, this is, you know, this is almost a 15-year period, 96 through 2010. That line going across the middle is salmonella in humans. This isn't, you know, this is human salmonellosis, and it's not changed in a long, long time. It kind of upticked. Actually, I'm trying to think. CDC just gave out data the week before last, and Campylobacter went up, and I think salmonella may have ticked down a little bit, but you know, no one's jumping on it. You know, all of these things are fairly static in humans. So it begs the question of, you know, are we making any progress? Can't tell you. You know, if you look at that E. coli 0157, that probably was associated with a lot of attention in the beef industry, but it's a lot more rare event in beef than it is salmonella in chicken. So, you know, we may have not, you know, also E. coli is also not found much outside the ruminant organism. So it's not free living in nature. It's, you know, there's a ruminant around somewhere that's harboring it. You know, it's not like salmonella that's can be anywhere in nature. So this is one of the things that we're looking at. And one of the reasons why CDC went to Walmart and back on the beef issue several years ago, and now on the poultry 2 years ago. And so, you know, people who sell chicken to Walmart, you know, have to show a 5 log reduction, 4 logs in slaughter and another log in processing after slaughter. And that's probably why we're down to 2% positive in parts. And that's Walmart data. Next slide. Campylobacter, on the other hand, it's one that's associated with raw milk, but also raw poultry. And I want you to look at that lower number. The infective dose is low. The other thing is, you know, and I probably should put this in Fahrenheit, 32 degrees centigrade is the low end of where it grows. You know, that's about 85 degrees Fahrenheit or 80 plus. In other words, this organism does not even grow at room temperature. In other words, once you kill the chicken, it doesn't grow. You can set it on the counter, it doesn't grow. The temperature is too cold, it's microaerophilic, it doesn't really like oxygen. It wants an environment that is 15 or 5% CO2, and only 5%, no, mostly CO2, only 5% oxygen. Air is 20% oxygen. It's too much for Campylobacter. It's hard to maintain in a laboratory. It's so finicky. However, it doesn't take much to make you sick. And there's a fairly high level on chicken. So just handling the chicken is the dangerous part. Easily killed by cooking. Very seldom do we have outbreaks. It's almost always individual cases. And it's the person who handled the chicken and then put their hand to their mouth or touch something and spread it somewhere else. So handling chicken, prepping it, is the risk. Next slide. I've had the opportunity to go to New Zealand a couple of times and be with the folks at Tegel. And one of the things they use is leak-proof packaging. The purge that comes out of the package could easily have that. So, there's actually packaging you can actually ovenable that you can take an outer wrap off and put the inner wrap product and package in the oven just with a pinprick so it doesn't leak. Next slide. This is consumer education, and this is in Iceland. One of the reasons I bring this up, New Zealand was, the world's leader still is, in Campylobacter per 100,000 people of population. It's over 10 times what it is here, and Iceland was up about that range too. So you can tell that cross-contamination, if you're looking at that bright blue, is the issue. Like I said, I don't speak Icelandic, but wait till you see the next one. I'm not going to try to read it. Next one, please. I think you can figure out that this causes a diarrheal illness. Someone's prom got ruined because they handled chicken or raw milk. Who knows? Next slide, please. So I can tell you from a poultry perspective, if we look at the left-hand side, this was actually where we started implementing in '97 was when the zero tolerance for fecal contamination went into place. In '98 is when HACCP started. So you can see that they didn't start testing before '97, but the poultry industry had a big cleanup in that era, and you can see it made a big difference. But since 2003, it's been pretty flat. That orange bar going across is the Healthy People 2010. And then the box down below, we didn't meet the Healthy People 2010, but we got close. And so in 2010, they dropped it down to 8.5. They dropped it by a third. Next. However, it actually went up. And actually 2016 just came out week before last, and it's gone up actually up to about 14 something for 2016. That's 14 cases per 100,000 people. Like I was saying, New Zealand's 150,000, and I think the UK is 150 per 100,000. So they're well over 10 times what we are. But I think they handle a lot more whole chicken. We don't sell a lot of whole chicken in this country. Next slide, please. Staph aureus produces a toxin, a heat-stable toxin. Once it's formed, it doesn't matter what you do. It's really only a problem with cooked products. It usually comes from hands, catering, human skin, noses. Next slide, please. Yeah, there was a recall, and we've seen much more of these lately in the last few years associated with breaded product, because we've realized that we need to maintain control of batter. On breaded product, you usually go through a batter. You take flour, hydrate it, and you run it, circulate it through a coating system, but you're recirculating. So it's touched the product and it's being recirculated. And the federal regulations require that if you want to keep using it, you have to keep it under 40. And if you're willing to get rid of it within just a few hours, you can let it go up to 70. But what has happened is, if people lose control of that cooking or cooling process, and they can't document that they had control of the batter before it was cooked, then there's a chance that staph grew and produced toxin. And we've had several recalls associated with battered product in the last few years. You know, flour by itself is not dangerous, will not support the growth, but once you hydrate it into a batter, yeah, it'll support anything. Next slide, please. And I think this, we're in the last organism, Listeria monocytogenes. It's very dangerous. It gram-positive, killed by cooking, which is what pasteurization is. It grows at refrigeration temperature slowly. It's psychotrophic, but it's pretty much everywhere. There's, one of the reasons we look at deli meats. The part of the issue is actually on the raw meat, there's some level of Listeria on the product. And so every day you're bringing this into your work environment. And so you have to have there is no HACCP plan for sanitation to eliminate this from the ready to eat side of an operation. There is no, one and done fix. It's every day you have to clean and you have to eliminate harborages. And this is the one that in the FDA world, we're seeing, a lawyer put it that FSMA gave FDA the mandate to stop foodborne illness. Now, I promise you it won't, but they're being very aggressive with sampling. And if they find Listeria monocytogenes anywhere in your manufacturing environment, they're going to expect you to take action. And it won't be, and I was just reading it today, it's not about root cause, it's about root source. You're going to have to find out where the source is. I used to tell people not to check because it was unclear how FDA would react to some of the positives found. In the USDA world, we're allowed to have what's called sentinel site programs. And I think FDA has also gone to that. So you can actually look for it, and if you find it once, you can correct it without taking action in the environment. Some people were not sampling previously food contact surfaces. It's now at the point where you probably do need to be very proactive in your control of this organism because it is so dangerous, both to people and to businesses. Next slide. I had this slide to end my last presentation, and I'm bringing it back for those of you who didn't see it because the very last part is the key. In manufacturing, we look at the process. We don't judge the product typically. You're producing something that's wholesome, nutritious, tastes good. When you're making a product, you do it based upon the quality because that's what keeps customers coming back day in, day out. It may or may not be free of bacteria. If you're producing raw meat, it's not. You know that if someone mishandles it, there could be a real problem. And your challenge is to do it at the lowest possible. You want to control risk. You don't want anyone getting sick. However, you can't control what they're going to do. If we cooked everything, if all you ever got was cooked food that was done in a processing plant, life would get pretty boring. It wouldn't be enjoyable. Now, your sampling program may be robust, but consumers test your product 100%. When I first started off in the industry, I was a production supervisor, and I found myself thinking, not in terms of food, but cases of product, trying to get the numbers out. So many pounds per day, so many pallets, whatever. And losing sight that every portion that we made, someone was destined to eat. And when you talk about feeding your family, well, you're feeding other people's families too. It is 100% testing. So with that, I'm done and happy to take questions.
All right, thank you very much, John. I'll remind everyone who's in attendance that if you'd like to ask a question, you can either use your control panel to raise your hand, in which case I will unmute you and you can ask your question, or you can type a question into the questions box and I'll read your question out loud to be answered. So while you guys are thinking about questions, I'll just remind you that our next webinar will be the intersection of business planning, risk management, and food safety, and it will be on June 8th. I would encourage you to go to our website, which we have listed on the screen right now at indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety, and click on the webinars tab, and you'll see all of our remaining webinars listed there. And the links so that you can register to attend them. I would encourage you to register for all the webinars remaining in this series. I'd also like to announce that in the introduction to this webinar, I mentioned that we'll be having in-person trainings. We do have an in-person training, a FSMA grower training, scheduled for Wednesday, May 31st, and Thursday, June 1st, in Rapid City, South Dakota. So if you know a native farmer or food producer who would be interested in attending a food safety training in Rapid City, South Dakota, please pass this information on to them. You can call the phone number that's on the screen and we will make sure that you have all of the information that you need to attend. The difference between the webinars and our in-person trainings is that if you attend an in-person training, you will be eligible to get a certificate, an Association of Food and Drug Officials certificate. And so that is a food safety certification that's important to have. So please call the number on the screen if you'd like to register for that food safety workshop. All right, we did have a question that came in, and it says, I've heard that effective microorganisms, EM1, has been evaluated by the USDA and found to kill salmonella. Have you heard anything about this?
Well, I'm not sure I've not heard anything about EM1. I'm not sure what the reference is. Is that a compound or a microorganism? Or is it a virus, a phage?
This question came in from Carol. Carol, I'm going to unmute you, and that way, if you like, well, it's not allowing me to do that. If you'd like to go ahead and type in a follow-up response or a question, or if you want to unmute on your end, I think that's the issue, then you're more than happy to discuss this with John. And she is not responding yet. Okay, let's see here. She says it's a set of 3 microorganisms from the soil discovered in Japan in the 60s.
Okay. So it's like a probiotic that you apply to animals in the feed, or that's what it sounds like.
Yeah. I'm going to say that we may need to, her response is yes, and all plants. We may need to do a little bit of research on this.
Yeah, it's not something I'm familiar with.
Yeah, and we will get back to you on that. I'm going to go ahead and write down your question, and we will consult with our in-house experts and make sure that we get you an answer. If you wouldn't mind jotting down your email address in the questions box, I'll be sure to get back with you with an answer.
Yeah, there are the possibility of phages, viruses, that are developed for Listeria. And I think they've started doing some for Campylobacter. However, the issue with Salmonella, there's 2,000 types, and it's hard to have anything that's going to be effective against all of them across the board. We do use some probiotics, and if you're going to feed them to animals or direct fed, but actually adding it to plants, I don't know of any restriction on that. Usually you have to know what's in it. So it probably is certainly possible. A lot of the lactic acid bacteria produce pediicides or other things that are antimicrobial that kill their bacterial toxins. So they're probably lactic acid bacteria, but I've not heard it being used in a food production process. There's a lot about produce I don't know, which I think is probably where you're coming from. Plants have their own mechanisms for keeping out bacteria. Salmonella typically doesn't impact plants whatsoever.
All right, thank you. And I have jotted down your question, and I've got your email address, so we'll look into that, and I will get back to you as soon as possible with an answer. Are there any other questions? Okay, I am not seeing other questions. So with that, we will wrap up today's webinar. I'd like to again thank our presenter, Dr. John Marcy, with all the helpful information, and encourage everyone to go to our website at indigenousfoodandag.com/food safety. There's a lot of information there, including how to register for the remaining webinars. We'll also be posting information about our upcoming in-person workshops. And also, you'll see the number listed on your screen. If you want to call, if you have any questions about any of these trainings, please contact us and we'll help you to the best of our abilities. Thank you, everyone, for... wait, hold it right there. I'm getting some information in. All right, I've got another question. And this one is actually coming from Dr. Goodwin. It appears that there are many possible sources of foodborne pathogens in produce that could be controlled by cooking, but much of the produce eaten is not cooked. What do you suggest as the best first line of defense against spreading pathogens? Maybe worker training is most important, toilets and hand washing?
Is that the end of the question?
Yeah, I think the question is
Okay.
the essence of the question is what is the best first line of defense against spreading pathogens?
Well, you need to know what your environment is, particularly the water and the what surrounds you. The spinach issue in the Salinas Valley, California, they had a dairy farm up a hill with cattle, and there was feral pigs that would run up there and then run down the hill through the spinach, and they transferred E. coli that way. So you got to know what water's uphill. If you're in the low spot, you better know what the water is, around you. High ground would be better than low ground. You got to know if you're under a flyway, what is the, animal, because they can spread it. Most of the apples and things like that were deer that caused the E. coli. So when you talk about lettuce and leafy greens, it's a matter of making sure, if there's workers in the field, that they have, hygienic resources. When, restaurant chains go look at the fields where they're harvesting, and the people working are paid by how much they pick. If they have to go more than a few feet to go to the bathroom, they may not go to the bath. They may not use the porta potty. They may go right where they're standing. So you got to make sure it doesn't cut into their reward system. You have to make it easy, and the hand washing station has to be right there. It's understanding human nature, if that's what you're looking at. So training is always going to be important. Supervision is going to be important, and understanding that there's basic needs, and if you're not paying them enough, or if they have to lose money to go to the bathroom, well, they may not walk 50 feet. The basic thing is just to understand the environment that you're growing produce in.
All right. Thank you. We do have a comment who came in from one of our attendees, and he says that FDA's produce safety rule provisions will go a long way to preventing foodborne illness associated with fresh produce.
They will. But there's a lot of attention to detail, and they're not prescriptive. You'll have to apply them as it fits within your situation, and it will require good supervision.
All righty, very good. That looks like we've reached the end of our questions and comments. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which again will be the intersection of business planning, risk management, and food safety on June 8th. Thank you for attending, and we'll see you next time.